Good morning and welcome to the third episode of the San Antonio ISD Instructional Influencer Series. The idea for the Instructional Influencer Series was born out of a desire to connect with other educators during a time in which we are all facing unprecedented challenges. The episodes are structured as a conversation, allowing us to ask the questions that we all may have and share some approaches taken to solve common educational issues. The conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, but we encourage you to add your thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat. At the end of the episode, we will circle back and respond to your contributions. So today's episode is on the new math. It's as easy as pie. And given today's topic, we have a word problem for you. So please listen carefully and be prepared to answer the following question. I'm going to put it in the chat as well. Okay. The question is, how many combined years of educational experience do our panelists have? Okay, so you're going to have to listen. And at the end of the intros, I will ask everyone to submit their solutions into the chat. Okay, so our session features host Kendra Doyle, Senior Executive Director for Curriculum Instruction and Assessment. Kendra has had 12 years in mathematics education as a teacher, specialist, coordinator, assistant, and assistant director prior to her current position. Today's guests include Stacey Knudson, Director for Elementary Mathematics, and Jeff Merithew, Director for Secondary Mathematics. Stacey has 24 years in education as a teacher, specialist, assistant director, and director. Stacey has also been a trainer for the TEA Math Academies. Jeff has 20 years of experience in math education, most of which was in North Carolina and includes working at the State Department of Education, turning schools around. Okay, hopefully you had your listening ears on and are ready to answer the question, how many combined years of education experience do our panelists have? We'll do a chat flood. Oh, Angela. Okay, everyone enter their answers. You guys are so smart. We can math it up. 56 is correct. That's just a lot of years, a lot of experience on our panel. Amazing. Okay, I have one more math tidbit. Jeff has a beautiful daughter who was born on March 14th. Math fans, if you know, you know how special that is. Both Stacey and Jeff have been presenters at their regional, state, and national levels for their work in SAISD. And we are so very excited to learn from this conversation today. Let's get started.
All right, thank you, Janet. Appreciate that introduction. Okay, guys, so I want to just get right to it because I've been out there in the world and I keep hearing this over and over, like, what is this new math that they're teaching in school? Like, why isn't it like the way we learned when we were growing up? And it doesn't make sense and it doesn't work. So I wanted to just get right to it and ask you both to like kind of give us your perspective about why do we hear people saying this? Like, what is the new math? And ultimately, like, what is different about the way maybe we learned math when we were growing up in school versus the way kids are taught today? So I'm going to start off, let Stacey get it going, and then we'll let Jeff add on. But everyone is saying that out there. So we want to know, we want you to break it down for us. What is this new math?
Okay, well, really, thanks for having me here today. But really, math isn't new. There's nothing about math that's new. It's just the way in which we're teaching and the expectations that we have for our students that might be considered new. If you think about it, when we all were growing up, and even the parents to our students that we're teaching right now, when we were all growing up, really math was all about memorizing facts and procedures, and there was very little emphasis on understanding. I don't remember doing a whole lot of problem solving necessarily, and there certainly wasn't any kind of application to my real life, like how I would need to know this in the future. And so I think now the new math that everyone keeps talking about is just because we want students to understand the concepts and the skills and see how they're connected and see how they relate to our real life. And we really are looking at building that conceptual understanding for our students and seeing how they can make the connections between their ideas, interpretations of what maybe data that they see or representations that they see, and having the opportunity to really collaborate and explain and work with our peers on solving problems and really being flexible in how they are able to attack a different type of problem.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
that's great.
Stacey. You know, you said something, Stacey, that made me think, because you're right. I remember sitting in elementary and they had a cassette tape and it had songs to learn our math facts. And we just sat there and we sang our math facts every day. So you're right. That's how we kind of tackled math, and it was very disconnected from, real life application that I remember. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, that was great. The piece that I would probably add on to that from secondary's viewpoint is as we've progressed from like the 80s, 90s, 2000s to where we are today, technology has started to really advance and become so much more accessible by people. And so one of the things that happened, or as my daughter would say, what happened was that now we have all these different fields that can use technology in a way that they've never had before. And while we had spent so much time learning all these algorithms, these math facts, as you sort of call it, the engineering side of the fence, or even sciences, started to push back, and the education became, so, well, wait a minute, we have technology that can do all these little algorithms and routines much quicker and more accurate than you ever will. What it can't do is it can't really build this big conceptual picture of like, what happens when I change this about it or this about it? How now might the answer or the process need to be adjusted? So they continue to push from the education side of the fence, like we need to redevelop more of that conceptual understanding to bring a little bit more of a balanced picture to a student's mathematical understanding. Yes, those procedures are important, but there needs to be that counterbalance of the conceptual understanding that we can now rely on when technology really can't figure those types of things out.
And can I add too, I think also, like, we grew up, and I still hear it today, like, well, I'm just not a math person. And it was, if things didn't come to you very quickly or very easily, you were immediately considered just like bad at math. And so I think a lot of the folks that are saying that they're just, we're teaching new math, it's because they didn't grow up understanding it. They don't see the purpose in why they were learning something. And so I think we're really trying to get beyond you're born a math person, whereas everyone can really grow to be a math person.
Thank you guys both. I love those perspectives. And yes, I agree, like making sure that we have meaning, making sure that everyone, I see in the chat, they're saying growth mindset, yes, that everyone has the ability to be successful through, study, hard work, meaningful connections, application of this. Okay, so kind of along the same lines, I wanted to get you guys' perspective about in the classroom, when we're talking about, I think you said it, Jeff, procedural or, different conceptual understanding, and this shift to making sure that we're having really connected and relevant mathematical experiences in the classroom. There might be a lot of teaching practices that you're seeing that maybe don't contribute to that, and even misconceptions that you're seeing in the classroom that aren't necessarily being addressed. So let me toss it to you first, Jeff. I'm wondering, what are some of those either misconceptions or practices that you're seeing that take away from where we're trying to be with mathematics and making sure that we have relevant mathematical experiences for our kids? And why do you think that those continue to persist even today?
It's a good question. One of the things that's interesting about the way we teach mathematics in our country, if you look at some of the other countries that do, like typically people point to Asian countries like Japan, China, etc. There's a bit of a different philosophy on how math instruction works. In the US, we have this very hyper sensitivity towards like high stakes tests, getting the answer. And so the teaching process tends to be towards that end, where the focus is so much on run through the problem, let's get an answer, run through the next problem, get an answer. And we place all this emphasis on getting the answer and getting that right answer. In other cultures where they really focus on that teaching process around how did we use math in this process. The answer, while it's important, the emphasis is so much more on like what we're doing and how we're getting to that answer. So it's a lot more around the justifying of thinking. And so most of us were trained in this focus of let's just get the answer, move on to the next problem, get the answer, move on to the next problem. It's almost like a relic of that factory building mentality where we're all going to rinse and repeat it. Is like a legacy of our education system. And so while we were trained in that methodology, we tend to then bring that out in the mathematics classroom. And one of the things that's really difficult for us is, as a math teacher, I don't have a lot of stimulus to force me to think differently about mathematics and change my my pedagogical practices in the classroom. Where there's like great value of having things like, you know, different events that you attend, national math conferences, where you start to go open the door and see like, oh, I've been doing a certain thing with my students that has produced certain types of results, but there's other ways that I could go about doing that that might bring out a richer understanding. So one misconception we need to really address with teachers is that focus on just running and rushing to the answer. A second big misconception that we tend to see a lot, not just like here in Texas, but sort of across the country, as Stacey sort of alluded to it, like not a lot of us are really math people. And, you know, like when you're in our field and you talk about like, you know, you're at a party and people are like, hey, what do you do? Like, I'm a math person. Like, it's a pretty big conversation killer. Like, oh, I wasn't a math person. I'm going to go talk to somebody way more interesting to it. It's like we have to help teachers build inside what we call this kind of positive disposition towards mathematics inside of our students. Like, how do we, in the engineering of our class lessons, like build like a joy and seeing a beauty and a wonder in mathematics? When they leave K-12 and get into like, let's say college studies or into the workforce, they start to see how the mathematics is used in these really interesting and powerful ways, whether it's science, whether it's business statistics, you know, even something as crazy as like gambling or looking at the weather, where the case is, they see how math is really powerful. And it's like, how do we bring that back into the classroom experience? So we shift a little bit away from kind of the routines and memorizing these processes to let them think deeply about the math and how we're using the math and how we're using problems to illustrate kind of this big conceptual picture of mathematics. The last piece that I would say that's really difficult for teachers is we have a very single slice of our year that we focus on. Like, I'm a sixth grade math teacher, and so I think about just sixth grade mathematics. And there are unintended consequences to the teaching process I may put in place for, let's say, something simple as the ratio. Like if I have, you know, 3 cups of sugar to 4 lemons that I'm going to make my lemonade. And the way that I teach my kids to then build bigger ratios of that, let's say I want to make, you know, 16 gallons of that particular recipe. The methodology I use to train my students to think mathematically may or may not be beneficial depending on what the math does in grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, grade 10. And so there's a lot of doors open for us to have some rich conversations about, if we think about math this way in grade 6, it produces really great foundation for grade 7 or for grade 8. Eventually, when I get up to calculus, for them to think about, what do I mean by the rate of change? How fast is one quantity changing and compared to others? So I think that's one thing that's challenging for us as math teachers, is kind of get out of our comfort zone and start talking to math teachers up the line and even down the line, depending on where you're at in the school setting, to talk about, how does the math really work? How does it connect across these grade levels so kids can come to a much richer understanding of mathematics? So those are a couple of things that really ring true for me.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
And so much of what you said resonated with my experience too, as far as, you know, in Texas, particularly, our tests are always changing, our standards are changing, and we've got this huge pressure on accountability. And so it can be tempting to want to teach tricks and shortcuts. And so I think both you and Stacey have kind of talked about, you know, what is our goal? Is it about getting efficiently and quickly to an answer, or is it about understanding the thinking around a problem and being able to apply different ways of thinking in different problem situations? And then definitely what you said, Jeff, about how, you know, my approach in this grade level and this course may or may not support math development as I, you know, continue up through the system. Like the vertical alignment of mathematics, especially when we're teaching tricks and shortcuts, can really undermine the work that or the development of a student's mathematical thinking in future courses as it builds. So I appreciate you bringing that to the forefront. But Stacey, you've got more. I'm ready.
I do. I have more. This is something I think I'm pretty passionate about because I feel like oftentimes we are creating these misconceptions for our students at a very early age in their academic journey. And oftentimes by creating these misconceptions, which are clearly unintended. I don't know a teacher out there that's like, oh yeah, I want to totally mess them up forever and ever. But I don't think sometimes kindergarten teachers, what they say, or first grade teachers or second grade teachers realize that the impact it's going to have as students move throughout the trajectory of their educational experience. And so once a student has been taught something, and it could be very simple, that would lead to a misconception, it's very difficult for our future teachers to kind of unteach that. So like, I think of an example of oftentimes when we're teaching about the equal sign, for example, it's always, well, the answer is coming, but that's really not what, it's not 2 + 2 = 4. What that means is that this side on the left should be the same amount as what's on the right. And so that affects their algebraic thinking all the way through their career. And so, we found, 8th grade students miss questions like that all the time on standardized tests. And so, and it's something that's created, I think, at like a very early age, and it's very hard to unteach that thinking. I was also thinking about, this is a big one for me, when I hear all the time, well, you can't take a bigger number away from a smaller number. And oftentimes that comes from when we're trying to do the standard algorithm where we have it, written out vertically, and we're trying to teach, again, those steps and those tricks and those explicit rules about you can't necessarily take from, the bottom number from the top number, but that is creating a very terrible misconception that, negative numbers don't exist, or they're not looking at numbers as a whole. They're looking at them by specific place value, the digits and the place value. And so by teaching that very early on in those tricks about borrowing next door and nothing on the floor or something like that, like it creates this craziness for kids in their heads. They're like trying to remember all the songs and the things that their teachers have told them, and they can't. It all gets jumbled up, and then we've created a monster for other teachers to kind of have to fix. We could go on. There's, about comparing fractions and, using the butterfly method, and it doesn't work. What does that have to do with anything? And until a student actually knows why something works, then that's how the trick makes sense. But like, if anyone's looking for, I think, a place to continue to kind of see what kinds of misconceptions are out there that we're teaching very early on, there's a great article. It's called 13 Rules That Expire. And I highly recommend that article because it really makes you think about what you say, even as far as like academic vocabulary that's being used, and that could be used in the wrong way.
Great point, Stacey. And I wonder if sometimes, a challenge, at least for students, are that every year the rules might be changing, right? Like it's really hard to understand mathematics because this year the largest number goes on top, and then next year it could go either way. And then the next year I could, subtract a bigger number from a smaller number, when last year I thought I couldn't do, like it feels like when we're teaching, like, in such a way that it's like, this is what it is. And it's very like limited, and I'm not seeing the full number system or the possibilities, that the rules keep changing. It's hard to keep up. And so I can understand how that can be a little bit tricky for kids. Okay, so I hear these words all the time, and I wanted you guys to have an opportunity to kind of explain in layman's terms what this means. But whenever we talk about mathematics, we hear about moving kids along, or moving our instruction along this continuum of like concrete, representational, abstract. Could you guys kind of like explain what exactly does that mean to move kids along the continuum, and then why? Why is that important? Why does that matter? You want to go ahead and start this one off, Stacey?
Sure. So the concrete representational abstract is really a way that we can ensure that our kids have a thorough understanding of the math concepts and or skills that they're learning. And so I think sometimes it's like, well, I use the manipulatives, and they still don't understand. So the manipulatives are not actually doing the teaching. They're just a way for the students to visually see what's happening. And really what I like about the word continuum is that it's not specifically chunked. It's not like I'm going to do the concrete first, and then I'm going to do the representational next, and then the abstract. It really does ebb and flow and build upon each other. So as a student, I have used objects maybe to create the situation, whatever is happening in the problem. And then what I'm going to do is to connect my learning. How could I draw a picture maybe, or what picture would match what I've actually built with my concrete objects? And then hopefully it would move to the more abstract, writing of the equation. So this is what it would look like with numbers. And so it's important for kids, to find their specific learning styles. And many of them have to visualize it first before they can even get to that abstract of applying it to specific numbers and specific equations.
Yeah, that's a great point. What's tricky for students is oftentimes they don't see themselves as math students or like good doers of mathematics. And so if you put yourself in their shoes, pick a course that you really never enjoyed. For me, something I never really enjoyed in high school was like chemistry, for example. I just couldn't get like all these little letters and numbers and electron orbits, and like I was lost. And so I didn't really enjoy it. So it was hard for me to understand it. So if you put yourself in your kids' shoes, they tend to be sitting in your math class, not able to really understand it. And when we talk about this process of building this conceptual picture of like, how do we go from concrete representations? One thing we're really trying to hit on is scaffolding. Like, we fundamentally believe that all kids have the ability to learn, but all kids are not at the same starting point. Like, they've got different neurons firing in different directions. And so how do we connect learning back to something that they know and they can recognize? So since I talked about my daughter was born on Pi Day, believe it or not, she's not a real great math person. And so in second grade right now, she's learning to compare sizes of fractions, like a half and a quarter. And what it means to talk about this, building the concrete representation. If you've ever unfolded a napkin, if it's sitting at your dinner table, you have like 4 squares on side of it. And so we would tear out 1 square of that napkin, because that would be the quarter. Or if we talked about a half, we would tear out 2 of those 4 squares. And for her to be visualized, okay, I see where half of a whole versus a quarter of a whole, it makes sense why one is bigger than the other, because she has a different starting point than another kid that has a bigger picture of what half and quarter may end up being. And so oftentimes we're trying to use this as a way to anchor learning back to something they know, to then get into what most people view mathematics as a bunch of X's, Y's, Z's, pluses, minuses, greater thans. And those are very abstract. They don't hold a whole lot of meaning. And kids tend to process a lot better when we can attach it to something that makes sense. So in our world, we're really talking about how do we make the math very cultural to the kids, like representing themselves in the mathematics and seeing like what their daily life is like. And that has a lot to do with how do we build this picture of, oh, math is something I can see and I can touch and I can feel. We've now lowered the floor for all kids to be able to access it. And now we can use scaffolding like the number line, for example, as a way to then build a little bit more of an abstract tool, but it's not totally abstract. Like, they can still picture what it is, to eventually, -12 + 5 or something like that to it. So it's going to give us a way to really help students access math at almost every level and make sure that they're really learning in a way that their brain can process well.
Can I add in? I was just thinking when you were talking about the fractions, my husband and I still talk about this with our kids. About 20 something years ago, McDonald's tried to come out with a 3rd-pound burger. And they, did studies with focus groups and things like that. And everybody was like, no, we can't have a 3rd-pound burger. You don't get as much of a burger as the 1/4 pounder. And that, like, right there should be like, oh, a kick in the gut. Like, wow, as an American society, that's where we're at. We don't want a we think we're getting less meat when it's actually a bigger burger. And so yeah, really understanding and being able to visualize and see how it is in their real life. I think about my husband who does flooring, and knowing those fractional pieces is super important when he's talking to customers. Even they're like, well, I think I want an 1/8 inch of a gap. And he's like, that's actually a lot larger than a 16th inch of a gap. And they're like, what? But 16 is bigger than 8. And you're like, they don't have the understanding of fractions. So yeah, kind of that, like you said, scaffolding that learning. And most people aren't seeing themselves as a math person. Like you said, it is a buzzkill at parties. Nobody wants to talk to you like, oh, you're the math person. But
yeah, I support the 3rd pound burger for sure. Thank you guys.
as long as there's no cheese on it.
Exactly. No cheese, please. That would not be a hamburger. That would be a cheeseburger. So, okay, I want to get to some really concrete examples of what this looks like, because you guys obviously know your stuff so well, and you're talking beautifully. And I want to get to a place where we can like make this super concrete for people that are like, I want to do this in my campus with my teachers. Like, I want to know what it looks and feels like. So I'm going to start with Stacey, and I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. So one is, I know that in our math standards, it talks about fluency. So I'm wondering, what does it look like at the elementary level to see fluency with kids? And then as you're talking about that, if you could go into like, just in general, what does, like, when you walk into a classroom, what should it look like? Particularly from the perspective of an instructional coach or an administrator that's working with math teachers, what should it look like in the class so that I know that I'm seeing and the kids are experiencing high quality mathematics instruction? And then I'll turn that over to Jeff to answer from the secondary classrooms.
Okay, I think really our challenge right now as teachers is having to teach in ways that we weren't taught. For most of us growing up, and I am speaking for myself, definitely, I remember very clearly still the use of time tests and of my math facts and the focus on that rote memory with speed without any consideration for like, do I understand why things work? Do I understand how knowing this one fact could help me with something else? Did I have any visualization strategies? And, really these time tests or that speed pressure and procedural teaching is what leads most of us, to include students right now, to having that math anxiety. And really fluency is about understanding and not memorization. And it's a lot like being a fluent reader. Children don't just memorize the words for basic recall. And really the same should go for their math facts. I think that like numerical fluency, it can be supported by like our fingers, by pictures, and all other kinds of representations that kind of fit with each student's conceptual understanding. So again, it's like being fluent in reading. Children are using pictures and other text structures to decode what they're reading that help them eventually to comprehend. And so numerical fluency really develops when students are communicating their thinking. And that's why we, in an elementary classroom, are really adamant about having those number sense routines happening on a daily basis, because this gives students that opportunity to communicate their thinking, where they can explain their strategies to others. And then you can hear what your peers are thinking and kind of consider like, wow, I hadn't looked at it that way, but you're right. And so really, I think most importantly, numerical fluency is really developed when students are, engaging with tasks and activities where the questions are really rich and students are kind of experiencing that discourse. Like, I want my students to know it's not about how fast you get the answer. So that whole, raising your hand very quickly, or I'm going to time you for a minute and then you slam your paper down when you're finished. And that really, that is more of the non-thinking answers only approach to like a worksheet or like Mad Minutes. And so I would rather see students experience those number talk routines or those different, various number sense routines that we are really hoping that students have the opportunity to experience. And so what we're finding is when we focus on just memorizing facts, students can't apply their knowledge. So they might have memorized 7 plus 16, and that equals 13, but then they could never apply that to 27 plus 6, knowing that 20 is just more, it's just 20 more than what was before. So I'll have an answer of 33. And so I think, that's what we're really hoping for and looking for when we're talking about fluency.
Jeff, what does fluency look like at the secondary level?
Fluency at the secondary level, the picture that I want to try to draw in your brains is like fluency is a component of what we would call mathematical rigor. Rigor has kind of this crazy definition for a lot of people. And so if you were to picture like a stool that you would sit on and it's got 3 legs, like the fluency is one of those 3 legs that's going to support the weight of the stool. The other leg is going to be conceptual understanding, and the third leg is the application of mathematics. So when we say a mathematically rigorous classroom, fluency is almost like a third of what you should see happening. There should be a third of it is conceptual, a third of it is application. So not necessarily at an individual lesson, because as Stacey alluded to, there's going to be moments where there's a heavy amount of fluency that doesn't have a deep conceptual understanding to it, and the application vice versa. But on the whole of the last math lessons you should see a good balance between those 3 components to it. And what it looks like for kids in our days is the ability to look at mathematics from various angles. So like an example, let's say this one time I had $100 bill. I felt like I was really rich. And so I went to a store, I bought a bunch of stuff and ended up being like $77. And so I hand my $100 bill thinking I'm super wealthy. And then you think about like, all right, if you were to figure out what kind of change you're going to get rather than just trusting the cashier to give you the right amount of money, if you have $100, the total bill was 77, like what are you going to get back from it? In classical mathematics, it's like, all right, we would set up the subtraction and you got to borrow the 1 and then bring it over and do all that. Like, but most people don't think of math that way. Fluency in mathematics is say, well, the difference between 177 is I can count up from 77 to get myself back up to 100, which is a way you can envision what subtraction is really trying to do. And so when we say fluency at the secondary level, we're trying to teach kids there's a few different ways you can go about reasoning through some type of a problem. Do you have enough command of the mathematics to be able to envision different routes you might go to get to that same sort of result? So again, it's that focus on understanding the math well enough and a rich understanding so you can look at it from lots of different angles. And that's what over time is going to build some really good solid fluency in their head.
I love that. I love that we don't all have to arrive at it the exact same way. And I know like at the elementary level, Stacey is supporting like, different ways of thinking so that we can find a way that works for us, but we also have a lot in our toolkit to be able to arrive at the solution to problems. Depending on the problem, I might use a different strategy, right? And so, we have lots of different avenues to get to a reasonable solution. So let me go back to Stacey. I want it to be like super clear, like open your brain to an administrator. I walk into a classroom. You mentioned that we're going to see numeracy routines. What are the other kind of things that we're going to see to know that this is a great, environment for mathematical thinking and learning?
So I would hope when an administrator would walk into a classroom that we would see students as the active learners and the teacher more as like the facilitator. And the students are constructing their own knowledge of the mathematics through exploration, through discussion with their partners, with other groups, a lot of collaboration where they're working together and they're getting to hear and experience what someone else is thinking, like you were saying, and really that reflection piece. They're reflecting on what they've learned and how that could apply to them. I would hope that you would see students having access to those rich tasks that are really challenging and interesting, kind of those low floor, high ceiling tasks where all students have an access point, an entry point to get in and to try one of their strategies and to see if they can share how they came to a solution. And really, we're not looking for a bunch of tasks where the answers can come quickly just by applying a rule or a procedure. Want to see kids reasoning and thinking, all of those process standards that arrive in our TEKS. and that sense making and how it can be applied to their everyday life. And then really, I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. There's a belief in the classroom that everyone can learn math and that everyone sees themselves as a mathematician and they persevere when they can't get the answer immediately. It's a safe place, I think, for them to share their ideas, and also a place for them to develop those convincing arguments. Like, it's okay to have a different answer, a different solution, a different thought. Can you justify why? And really learning from others' thoughts and ideas. And I really think we need to make sure in the math class, math is not separate from all the other content areas. Like, we're doing the reading, the writing, the speaking, the listening, all of the components that we would use in our other content areas. Those are found in our math classrooms as well. And I think, you know, the pandemic's kind of created maybe a gap in some of those, in some of their foundational understanding. And so we have to figure out how we can kind of buy back that time, and by making sure we're spending our time with our students on the most rich tasks that's going to get them, you know, the most understanding and how they can apply it.
Yeah, Stacey, you know, I'm hearing everything you're saying, and you are a huge advocate for with your mathematics classrooms, with making sure, like you said, that there's other skills that are brought in. Those kids are reading, they're writing at quick writes and quick write summaries. They are having so many opportunities to verbally talk through their thinking and hear other people's thinking. And that's other ways that they're like, oh, there's other ways to, you know, get these strategies. And then you support your classrooms with having so many, like, this is great for all students, but it certainly helps and supports our emergent bilingual students that have language development with the anchor charts that you push in all your classes, making sure that kids have opportunities to see that academic vocabulary, use it, practice it, write with it, speak with it. And also the same thing with the strategy. So you are doing so much excellent work at the elementary level, as far as making sure all those scaffolds and supports are in place for kids to have opportunities to experience success.
Right.
Okay.
And like, math is its own language, right? Sorry, I could keep going on and on forever and ever, but math's its own language. People don't just come out of the womb and at home they're talking about parallelograms and how they would, you know, where are the parallel and perpendicular lines and all the things. And so it really is learning another language as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jeff, what does it look like in your secondary classrooms?
It's a good question. Stacey's brought up some really strong similarities to what we would see in the secondary classroom. I would try to look at it from like an administrator's perspective. If you were to walk in a classroom, how do you know you're walking into like a really great high functioning math classroom? A couple things that I would suggest you would always look for. When you walk in, the first thing I want to look for is who's doing all of the hard work here. Normally, the teacher is like blood, sweat, and tears, like gushing mathematics out onto their kids to the point where maybe they get infected with the mathematics virus. And that hasn't resulted in the kind of gains and instructional understanding that we're like really hoping for kids. And so when you walk in the classroom, what I'm hoping you see in a great math classroom is that the kids are doing a lot of the figuring stuff out. A lot of times in great math teachers, they've come to this realization, like, we're actually using math as a cover to teach you how to think critically. Like, fundamentally, that's what we're trying to do, because that's going to transcend whatever pathway you might take post-school. And so as we think, how do we build that kind of thinking process in their kids? Well, you know, they learn by doing. Like, we've known that for thousands of years now. And so when you walk in the classroom, are the kids doing a lot of the figuring stuff out, or is the teacher doing a lot of the figuring stuff out for the kids and then handing them the results? And we want to see more of the kids trying to figure things out and wrestle with it. This always makes my math team chuckle, so I'm going to go Southern on you because I am by far not a Southern person at all. Traditionally, we use this model of like, I do one example, then we do some together, then you guys do some additionals. And if you look at data from the past, even past decade, it really hasn't produced a lot of great instructional gain in mathematics. Like, we're not producing great math students doing that. There's a time and a place for that. So the southern side of it, we say the model should look more like the you, y'all, we model. So it's like, I give you a problem, you try to figure it out by yourself for like a minute or two. Y'all get together in groups and try to wrestle with it, or wrestle with it if you're a real southerner. And then we come together and try to synthesize some of the learning and feel like, okay, what were some different approaches we took? What sort of similarity can we now draw across all these approaches different groups took? And then it's like the teacher is sort of like steering the mathematical learning in a particular direction to try to help kids. But by and large, the kids are doing a lot of that heavy lifting. If you're a book reader, we draw a lot from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. They've got some phenomenal books out there. One I would highly, highly recommend is Principles to Action. It's came out a few years ago, but it sets kind of like the core tenets around great math instruction should look like this. They have these like 8 effective math practices. And so as an administrator or a math coach or a math expert, every time I go in the room, I'm looking for evidence of some of these 8 math practices affecting teaching strategies to be coming out each and every time I set foot in the classroom. But kind of like the one big thing you're going to see in a great classroom is the kids are doing the lion's share of the work, because we know like that's how they learn. They learn by wrestling with it. And we want to really think about like, how do we support a productive struggle? So what we talked about with our math teams just yesterday of like, we see a lot of unproductive struggle in our kids. So how do we help them be really productive in their struggle, so that when I ask them to do the you part and even the y'all part, like they can actually produce some results. And like what Stacey is describing in that math classroom is laying such a rich foundation for kids to rise up through that math experience to be able to have a really productive struggle and start to figure mathematics out. So those are a couple of things that I would offer to administrators. Every time you set foot in the classroom, look, who's doing all that heavy lifting? You want your teacher to go home like all full energy, and your kids to be like exhausted when they leave that classroom because they had worked so hard.
Thank you so much, both of you guys. Okay, I have one last question, and we are just about out of time. So I'm going to ask for a short response to this question. Definitely a theme I've heard through everything you guys have said is about how we expect our kids to, or the environment that our kids are in, to foster a love for mathematics. It's meaningful, it's relevant, it's connected to what I know and what I have a growth mindset. We can all do it. We might not all do it identical, but we can all get there. And so my last question for you is, what would be your recommendation as far as how we as adults can make sure that we're fostering this joy of learning and belief in adults and kids that we can do math, and we can, what did you say, Jeff? Do math good and do it gooder? What would be your recommendation to have this environment on the campus? Like, how are we going to get there and have everyone with this belief that we're all capable? Jeff, you want to go first, and then we'll end with Stacey.
Sure. Making math real to kids is usually, I always come from the standpoint of my kids generally don't really care about mathematics. They don't see it as like interesting and viable as even a pursuit of learning. And so how do we invite them into that discussion? Like making the math real in the context around them. And I would say I'm like blown away by some of the teachers we have here in SAISD, because they do such a rich job at looking at the context and the life that our kids have, because they have great relationships with them. They understand like, oh, my kids are dealing with this. They really enjoy these types of activities. And they use that as the mathematics so they can draw the mathematics out of it. And the kids can see themselves in that context. Like, yes, I deal with that every day. Or yes, my parents are like this, or I live in this kind of situation. And that becomes the foundation of the mathematics they're using in the classroom. So it really connects to the kids. And over time, they start to see like, hey, you know what? Math is like applicable to me, like here as a little 7th grade kid and just my little slice of the world. And other teachers have also been able to open the doors and let kids see like, hey, there's a big world outside of San Antonio, like in other countries. And here's what numbers and mathematics and stuff looks like to them and how it plays out in their lives. And so we've got such great opportunities to connect like the mathematics to cultures, well, inside of ourselves here, outside. And that's when like the math becomes really important to them and they can find some great value in there. So as often as you can, if you can encourage your teachers to get out there and connect with some other math teachers, math conferences, there's some great books about culturally responsive teaching that we can really push ourselves to show more than just X plus 2 equals 6. It's really like, how do I contextualize that so the kids can see it and really it becomes like a part of them and they're really genuinely interested in it.
He said all the words. Thanks, Jeff. You took them all. No, I think what I would say for elementary, because I think once you get into secondary, you start to really know whether you like math or not. And so I think as an elementary teacher, we all really become elementary teachers because we love reading. We love like the bringing together of the students with the teacher. And so if we can find that deep love for math as well, and I think it's really getting past, like we said earlier, about, you know, how we were taught and all of the kind of roadblocks we had growing up, and knowing that you know, we have the opportunity to really set up students, all students, to love math as they go on into the secondary and maybe go into fields like that. And I would say, yes, certainly that culturally responsiveness that we have here in SAISD is, and we have such wonderful opportunities that we can invite our students into and see how that math really relates to themselves.
Thank you both. And I just want to point out, thank you guys for everything you shared. And if we run into each other at a party, you go ahead and you bring up your math topics. It will not be a conversation killer for me. I'm all about it. I'm here for that. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the panelists. Guests, if you could please show your love for what we have been talking about and our panelists in the chat. Anything that you took away, anything that you appreciated hearing, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the chat.